dozens of stories, personal essays, meditations, and inspirational reflections during the inaugural decade. They'd all had their brief lives, a small flourishing, then disappeared beneath the layers of years. I'd had no desire to dig them up. It was eye-opening, finally, to see that my ambivalence over having my earliest writings excavated and republished in the present came from a well-meaning conceit. I wanted to be read and known for who I am now. Naturally, the moment I came to this, paradox reared its head. What if knowing who I am now is incomplete without knowing who I was then? What if part of me was lost back there with that body of work? Did I have to return to the place of my origins as a writer in order to understand myself fully? Can we ever go forward without going backward? At some point, while nesting in this tangle of questions, I recalled something I'd read about Merton. First, I suppose you should know that Merton's writings were perhaps the most formative works I've ever read. His famous autobiographical book, The Seven-Story Mountain, written when he was a young man, had a life-altering effect on me when I read it at the age of 29, a few months before I decided to give myself over to writing. The book revealed to me the startling reality of the inner life, cracking open a raw longing for the divine and exposing an irrepressible hunger for that deepest thing in myself. So imagine my bemusement when I read that later in his life, Merton had a somewhat ambivalent relationship to the Seven-Story Mountain. Apparently, he felt it had created a myopic view of him. He had become heavily identified with the Merton in those pages, the pious young monk. He seemed to chafe at the thought of being frozen in those early years, as if they defined, described, and contained the whole of him. This awareness put me in the unlikely position of experiencing the truth of both sides of this odd dilemma. I knew the power of Merton's first work. I could not imagine the Seven-Story Mountain not being part of his canon or not being available in the world. And at the same time, I could relate in my own small way to his brooding tension with it. My early inspirational writing in no way parallels Merton's first masterpiece, but the moment I stood in the middle of this paradox, I was able to open my arms to my 30-year-old self, to the words that sprang from her portable typewriter in a corner of the den. Opening myself to the creation of this book, so aptly titled Firstlight, became an unexpected act of reclamation. The surprise to me in all of this was that Firstlight became a bridge, a way for me to return to my beginnings, to works that had been lost, orphaned, forgotten, and dismissed. It was a gift of reunion. On my 30th birthday, I walked into the kitchen of my brick house in South Carolina and announced to my husband and 2 children, I'm going to become a writer. That was my annunciation, in a kitchen, to a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old and a husband who was trying to get them to eat their cereal. My plan was earnest but highly unlikely. I lovingly refer to it now as my great absurdity. We should all have 1 or 2 of those in our lives, a hope so extravagant it seems completely foolish and implausible. I'd studied nursing and worked during my 20s in hospitals on surgical, pediatric, and obstetrical units, even spending one summer as a public health nurse. I didn't know anything about creative writing or whether I had any ability for it. All I had was the impulse and passion of my heart. It was during the months prior to turning 30 that my creative life began to wake up. I had the feeling of something urgent and necessary pressing in, wanting to be born. I think it had a lot to do with reading the aforementioned book by Merton and discovering the deep place within where I was sourced, the interior realm of the soul. My creativity seemed to emanate from making portals into this inscrutable land. For me, creativity is essentially a spiritual experience, a conversation between my soul and me. So it's probably not coincidental that my writing life began almost simultaneously with my initiating this conversation. The day after my birthday, I enrolled in a writing class in which the teacher gave us an assignment: write a personal experience article and send it off to a magazine. I wrote a very simple story about the first Thanksgiving after I was married, and submitted it to a writing contest sponsored by a magazine that I'd often seen lying about the house when I was growing up. The magazine was Guideposts, an interfaith inspirational publication with millions of subscribers, which had been founded by the late Dr. Norman Vincent Peale and his wife, Ruth Stafford Peale, in 1945. To my amazement, I was one of 15 winners who were invited to New York to a writer's workshop. You can ask anyone who was there and they'll tell you I barely opened my mouth the entire time. I believe the Guidepost staff assumed I was shy, but the truth was I felt like I'd been dropped off on a new and unknown planet. People spoke a mysterious literary lingo, in medias res, SASEs, takeaways, denouements. I'm pretty sure I was the only writer there who could not speak the language, who'd never had anything published, and whose whole assemblage of work was comprised of one story. Mostly, though, mine was the silence of a sponge soaking up everything. That was 1978. I would continue writing for Guideposts for the next 12 years. It was through Guideposts that I began an apprenticeship to the narrative form. I learned not only how to write stories, but to love them, to revere them even. I discovered the power of honest, personal, revelatory writing. Humans, I discovered, need stories the way we need air. The majority of writings in this book come from the work I did for Guideposts during those dozen years. When the publisher sent me the stack of work that had been compiled for this book, I was astonished at the assortment, the wide medley of variation. I discovered my first published piece in the pile, a story about an unusual experience I'd had with death and forgiveness while working as a nurse during my early 20s. You will find it in the last chapter. There were, in fact, several stories from the few years I'd spent as a nurse, as well as a plethora of stories about my mothering years, about my children, who now have children of their own. I discovered my recollections about the year I lived in Africa, meditations on my childhood and my grandparents, reflections on my marriage and on a stream of common moments, watching a bird feeder, a homeless man, a golf tournament. There were numerous chronicles about travels to the shore and to the mountains, as well as to the Chalice Well Garden in England and to Gethsemane Garden in Israel. I read articles I'd written about moments of crisis and transition, and short devotionals, anecdotes from which I'd extrapolated a message. Material from other sources exist here as well, notably a series of longer essays published in Weavings, a journal of the Christian spiritual life, written in my 40s, which contain more complex renderings of my spiritual experience. The works in this collection are not arranged chronologically, but gathered loosely around 13 motifs. You'll find an essay I wrote for Weavings in 1995, followed by a daily Guideposts devotional I wrote in 1983, both of them about solitude. In order to adapt the writings for the book, I made minimal edits, primarily in the form of tightening sentences, clarifying an insight, or adding a few words here and there, but otherwise the pieces remain unchanged. Perhaps it goes without saying that the collection does not comprise a whole portrait of my life during that time, but rather offers bits and pieces of it. Nevertheless, I'm the first to admit there's a revelation of myself going on here. At the core of personal spiritual writing is a hungering for wholeness, for self, for meaning. The question, who am I, reverberates quietly in these pages, as does a willingness to be known. I wonder sometimes why I chose to make my spiritual musings visible. I want to believe it is mostly because such vulnerability creates what we might call a soulful being together between the reader and the author, a kind of communion born through the meeting of vulnerability and identification. It is in this delicate communion that books bestow their small transformations. I have come to love the following words by the French Nobel laureate Albert Camus. A person's life purpose is nothing more than to rediscover, through the detours of art, or love, or passionate work, those one or two images in the presence of which his heart first opened. Where did your heart first open? And how shall you find your way back to that dawning?